So we have a few minutes to take questions or comments. Do you want to come up? I mean, at this point. And Jack is going to be on the video feed, so you can also ask him questions. Yes?
Well, first I want to say, I think this is just a fantastic project and collaboration, so I'm really impressed with what you guys are doing. I was wondering if you did any front-end evaluation with visitors at the St. Louis Zoo to understand what their thoughts were about Alaska Native communities, and if you've done summative evaluation to see if you've increased a sense of empathy with those local people.
There were several components that could be considered front-end evaluation for that exhibition. Since we were diverging so much from what had been done before, there was almost not even a frame to ask those questions. So we were, I was doing the work and mostly extrapolating from institutional anthropological work I had been doing at the St. Louis Zoo, and also a larger project of trying to understand the relationship between people in St. Louis and topics like climate change, and how the communities themselves in St. Louis were operating around those questions. So there was no precedent for this kind of project in the city, and certainly not in the zoo. So it was kind of hard to ask, but we can tell you that we did a lot of conversations with our docents. How many docents does the zoo have?
Over 200.
So there are over 200 docents at the zoo, and as I kept going up to Alaska, I would come back and do brown bag lunch presentations, and one of the really cool things that happened was that it was almost like an it was in fact an action research approach, because I would come back and I would get asked questions like, oh, that's so great that you're up there to teach the natives how to stop hunting the bears. And we would start a conversation about subsistence hunting. And I think right now you can go to the St. Louis Zoo and meet any docent, any interpreter, and say, so what are you doing about the natives hunting the bears? And their answer is going to be, let me tell you about the importance of subsistence hunting. So.
And in terms of summative, one of the challenges we realized with our summative evaluation is that because of the positioning of the video, it wasn't getting the typical percentage that museum videos would get. So we didn't have a lot of really statistically significant data yet in this first run. But because of the Nanuuq, I'm not sure what else to call it, but the Nanuuq is hopefully going to be going in soon, and we'll be able to get research on it right away and figure out because with the temporary one, we knew more people were watching it and they were watching it for longer. So having that plus a new video, we're hoping to get a little more data just overall when it comes to what our visitors are hearing. But what we do have, like Adrian was saying, with our docents and interpreters, are all of those right now are just the testimonials of all the conversations that are happening. One of our, I'm not sure if it was a docent or an interpreter, talked about a conversation they had with people from rural Missouri, and they brought up subsistence, and they had a complete and total connection with that because they were game hunters, and ended up being able to take that and talk about, transition that straight to a climate change conversation. So we have evidence of these really great conversations happening, so hopefully we'll get more summative data as we keep going along.
I think it's also important to say that this was a leap of faith for the zoo, and it's important to say that a lot of credit for this goes to the president of the zoo, who at the moment where the decisions had to be made, he decided several things. I don't know if you noticed in all of the photographs and the videos, this exhibition doesn't have interpretive signage. A lot of the work is done through theming and the collaboration with our Alaska Native partners. That was his decision. It was also his decision that we were going to take this approach because we had realized that the conversation about climate change, particularly in the Midwest, was basically bankrupt. There was nothing else to be gained by forcing the science of climate change into the conversation. So we wanted to see if having a conversation, period, and getting to know each other and making it intimate and like that experience that Lisa told about these kids saying, it's us, it's our bear, and now chatting as people do, we could build the kind of social capital that would generate other kinds of connections, that would generate other kinds of actions, not just the magical conversion to understanding and supporting climate change policy, but rather moving towards sustainable development. So all of those were the executive decisions that were made at critical moments in the exhibition development process that led to this.
Do you see this approach influencing or changing how other exhibits at the zoo are presented, like with other, like making connections with other communities? Is this something you're hoping to sort of infiltrate the rest of the zoo's practices?
In terms of resources, unfortunately, it's not something we're able to do with every new exhibit coming up as much as we would love to. But in terms of the in-person conversations and really having this learning community of what does it look like when you take a step back and really have a conversation instead of just, you know, scripting or something that was handed to you. And that has really, from what I've heard and what I've seen, really inspired our docents and interpreters to really do it other places and try it other places as well.
It's also, I mean, there are two answers to this question. We're trying to take over the world, and it's the expression of taking over the zoo. The beginning of all of this also has to do with the process of reorganizing the education department at the St. Louis Zoo, where we wanted to build true connections, like honest, direct connections with the collection, the staff, and the conservation programs that the zoo actually took on, so that every kind of conversation was this kind of direct, intimate, real conversation rather than conversations and signage about abstract things. That's already happening at the St. Louis Zoo, whether it's done in this way or other ways. But part of the reason for this symposium and part of the reason for coming here and insisting to have this conversation here is that, like I said at the beginning, the NMAI is probably the beginning of the new way museums are going to be effective and important. So we are trying to put together an initiative to teach other non-native institutions how to do this kind of work that is more culturally attuned, so that not just so that they remember like how to talk to communities and in a better way, but that the audiences can experience these narratives and these connections in a more genuine, direct, respectful, dignified way. So we'll see where that goes.
I was curious because it's occurring to me that it seems that if you had another animal at the zoo that is more local, that is threatened, maybe not as obviously as the polar bear at this point in time, but we can certainly project into the future and know that there are other species, that it would make a nice pairing to make it more relevant to the people visiting. I mean, there's a lot of, we know that the Arctic is the poster child of climate change, but we do have to bring it much more into people's real lives, make it more relevant. The science is abstract, and bringing it home rather than making people think it's somewhere. We have a documentary on climate change where we go to Kiribati in the South Pacific, to the Peruvian Andes with the glaciers, and to the Siberian Arctic. We also go to the Chesapeake Bay and talk to watermen who used to bring 200 pounds of lobster in. And you know, people hear that and go, lobster in the Chesapeake Bay? You know, so I just think that it would be that much more powerful, and especially if you could get people to talk about it in their own lives. Like we also talk about it at the end of the film, and people talk about skating on the Potomac River when they were young. Maybe a few people who have lived here for a long time, maybe no one's old enough in this room, anyway. But that wasn't that long ago when the Potomac River was frozen for a month in the winter. People would skate on it. So, you know, those.
Certainly, the beauty of this is that it could be done about a matchstick.
Igor talked about that.
The important. Jack?
can hear it.
Jack,
Okay.
what's up?
Jack? Oh, there he is.
Did you want to say something about that?
Well, I sort of heard, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just heard bits and pieces of the question, and I think what I heard was that if there was, you know, an additional animal or I guess a new way to draw attention to the cause or the species or the context or situation, I think is what the lady was getting at. And I agree if that's what I heard. One of the things that sort of makes polar bears different is that they're such a charismatic species. One of the things that made it really difficult in sort of continuing to fight for the continued subsistence harvest of polar bears is because they were so charismatic. And so you have people harvesting polar bears, you know, maybe a community will get one a year, but it's still considered, you know, quite frankly, caloric intake. And when you have communities feeding themselves, the majority of them feeding themselves through marine mammals, when you talk about, or when you think about walrus, which is a much larger percentage of their caloric intake, culture, lifeways, whatever you want to call it, that is a species that you know, should command more attention, because the probability of the same thing happening with the Pacific walrus as the uplisting of polar bears. So what I think I heard is something I've been thinking about is how do you make the plight of the subsistence user out in Gamble an issue that's important for the rest of the world to consider? Well, you make it an economic issue, right? And so I think the dialogue about subsistence, really resource use, needs to change. And if you start thinking, and I think it's happened, but I was really hoping that what we learned through the process, difficult process of polar bear management, would sort of be replicated in walrus management, because it's only inevitable that the listing and the implications will transfer to walrus, and that people need to be prepared and how to deal with that. So I agree, and I apologize if I hear incorrectly, but I think a new narrative has to take place about, because quite frankly, I think, you know, us just continuing to say that it's important to feed ourselves, it doesn't resonate the way that it should. And perhaps, you know, that discourse has changed. Now we hear about food security, so we went from subsistence to food security. Now we've started to go away from food security, and now it's become national security. So yeah, if there was perhaps another sort of animal at the zoo, maybe we could start to sort of adopt or adapt the way we shape the discourse when it really comes down to being able to feed yourselves.
One thing to keep in mind, and I think Stephen's presentation is kind of particularly interesting in this interdisciplinary conversation, is that while there have been many initiatives to do this kind of localized, context-specific organisms as proponents or the charismatic little fauna of conservation programs everywhere, there is something about the fact that certain organisms present themselves in the culture, in the history of these communities, that make them unique and make them somehow connected to us in ways that other species aren't. And so what you were discussing about the bear being present or not in representations, and present or not in mythology, and present or not in the way that we relate to this animal as opposed to other animals, that's sort of what's happening in conservation. That's sort of what happened with pandas. That's sort of what's happened with so many other organisms that we just seem, I think it's kind of, as we embrace the perspectives about this from these communities that we're collaborating with, that make the bear a cousin as opposed to other organisms, there is a reason for that, and they have been at this business much longer than we have. So maybe there's something there that makes the bear and no other organism. And yeah, so I can see both sides of the question, but there is something kind of, I think, interesting as we start adding more dimensions to this conversation, that we see that there are in fact some organisms that have that power.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to downplay the cultural importance of the polar bear and the incredible work that you've done. I guess for me, we're talking about a very urgent issue, and I would love it if the people who went to the zoo felt some ownership also. They weren't just seeing this happening way up there, where none of them have ever been.
Right.
But there was some way that this interpretive process would bring it into their own bones and heart.
Yes.
Where they would have some sort of an experience, because, you know, we have a very transient society. We're definitely not subsistence hunters here. But there are rural areas of our country, and there are Native American areas of our country, and there are people who have interactions with the natural world. Maybe it's not subsistence hunting, where there is that same cultural power. See what I'm saying?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
I think for me, like, this is such an interesting conversation, in particular because 2 weeks ago, my brother-in-law, who lives in Woodstock, New York, told us a story of how someone left their trash bins out, and a brown bear, mother bear with 3 cubs, got into the trash bins, and a call was made, and then I don't know which service it is that comes and takes care of the bears, but they killed the mother, and then they took the 3 cubs, and they told, there was some discussion about it, and then they told the community, we're going to raise them in this wildlife habitat, and then we'll re-release them into the local population in Woodstock. And just so many aspects of that were wrong to me, but a lot of it is because we're so removed from bears being a part of our everyday life, even if they are in the background or even in our backyards. And if this story that I just told happened in St. Louis, and then you said, well, here's the story of the polar bear, let's relate it to our local brown bears, like, how would people take it? Do they want to discuss that? You know, is it easier for them having the first step, this thing in the far distance, you know, and then maybe little by little it can be related to their own surroundings? I don't know.
But maybe one important lesson to gather from all of this is that we thought going into this, like every zoo goes into this, that we were putting together an exhibition about polar bears, and we ended up with an interpretation about how we relate to each other. What ends up, that's why I said that what seemed like a glib comment, that this could be done about a matchstick, because the really important thing that emerged from all of this is not the bear. The bear is really certainly important, and it's certainly charismatic, and Cali is this amazing bear. So we won the bear lottery with him. But what emerged out of this is this conversation here. What emerged out of it is the conversation of somebody who goes into the exhibition expecting to be pointed at and told that they are bad and wasteful and dangerous because of climate change. And now they're being told, you are somehow connected to these people who live far north because you use similar implements and you look at nature in similar ways. It might not be the case that they do subsistence hunting like subsistence hunters in Alaska, but a lot of the visitors of the St. Louis Zoo actually hunt, and they have a hunting ethic that is very significant. And now connecting through that and being able to see that we're family, just like our partners in the north consider themselves family to the bear, Now it's an extended family. It might not change the question of climate change immediately, but if I have learned anything, is that while the problem is urgent, the solution has to be thoughtful, respectful, and dignified, and that means being patient. And so that has to do with the conversation, with establishing the relationships, and that's what this exhibition is about in the end.
So are there docents in this space all the time?
As much as possible. We have, everyone has shifts and, you know, it's all kind of split up, but they're there as much as possible, and interpreters get assigned being there as well. And our interpretation staff is most populous during the summertime when we have most of our guests here.
And then building off of that, can I just ask, like Emil, so this was a massive experiment for our museum, the community curation, and there's been so much discussion, especially, I mean, looking now, we've disassembled those exhibits and we're installing other exhibits. I mean, Stephen, you've been here so long, it must have been like this massive, like, oh, this great idea at NMAI, let's see if it's gonna work. I mean, were people like, let's see if it works, let's see if it fails. And now, 10 years later, what is the conversation? You know, like, how does the museum see this, how does the Smithsonian see this experiment that we started? It's wonderful to hear that these ideas are evolving and being applied in other places, but what does it mean for us? You know?
Well, I also think that I think there were other museums doing it on a smaller scale, and the scale that we took it was to do 24 communities covering the whole Western Hemisphere. But I also think there are programs within the Smithsonian, is that Recovering Voices and some of the other that are consulting more with Native communities. So I mean, we're not just the only one doing this, but I think it opened it up more. I don't know, what do you think?
No, and I think one of the themes that I take away and what I admire about the zoo is the same kind of dilemma that I've had doing archaeological fieldwork in the north, where when I was a graduate student and sort of parachuting into the community of choice, you know, in typical fashion, and the realization that you've got to stop this kind of one-way flow of information and participation. You know, you get your bear, you bring it to St. Louis, you go get your artifacts, you take them back to Washington. And the real sea change, I think, and it's part because of the Native American Museum, it's partly because of repatriation, but I think there's the starting point now, you know, in academia or in the museum world is collaboration. You just can't do it. You know, you are not the only expert out there, the only person on the playing field. And one of the lessons I've learned, which you guys figured out on yourself, which is how to make it relevant to young people, because that's the future. I mean, why are we doing this? You know, we're getting old and gray and going to disappear shortly. We're the elders now. It's how do you engage young people, and so and I found the same thing. I found video is an amazing tool, and you know, the kids that I work with get bored digging their square holes in the ground, but they love filming the archaeologist digging his hole in the ground and creating an environment in which a conversation flows. And so a lot of my work, and I think the zoo as well, is trying, and what's the future about? And you know, I despair about our avaricious Western, you know, consumption of resources and lack of thinking for the future. But if you create opportunities for young people, they're the future, and that's a lot of where I think we're going. And you know, and you get these kids interested, and you get that sparkle in their eye about there's ways to think, there's ways to educate, there's ways to create opportunities, and that's sort of the question I would like to see, which is what kind of opportunities can you make so that the program doesn't benefit St. Louis entirely, but it's also as a way to feed back to the community. And I really respect the way that you know, you just had everything vetted and just make, you know, just that collaborative sort of approach. But the next stage is keep on swimming, I know, but you know, it's getting further and further to land, you know, to the iceberg, and we need to be creative. I think that's the challenge to the museum, and the challenge to the zoo is how we just, it's not status quo anymore. We really need to be aggressive and think through these kinds of projects and passions. So.
I heard it called squirrel research.
Mhm.
You go in, then you go back into hibernation for a year, and then you come back out for your season, then you go back into hibernation.
It's,
I don't want to do that.
Sorry, I just noticed it's 3:20. I don't know if the feed is still up and
Yes, it is.
and do we have people on the feed?
I don't know if we're.
You can ask another question.
Yeah, please.
I guess my question was a little bit about funding. Like I know you mentioned just in response to my first question, just like it's an expensive process. And I know from NMAI as well, those inaugural exhibits where it's a lot to do that level of work. I was wondering if anyone had any comments about how do you show the value of that process, and how do you keep working towards increasing funding for these kinds of programs, just showing how important they are or how productive they are.
In the case of the St. Louis Zoo, it actually reduced the cost of interpretation and exhibits by more than half.
Wow.
Because the traditional way in which these zoo exhibits are done is very technology heavy, very object heavy, and by making it a more intimate, more almost like crafted exhibition, the interior space of the viewing area for the polar bear was going to be this thing, and we ended up consulting with the Native Heritage Center in Anchorage, and they were incredibly gracious and incredibly generous, and they showed us their blueprints for their work, etc., and taught us that whatever we think about igloos in the north has no bearing on how traditional houses were actually built. And so the construction company ended up using found driftwood from Missouri to build the interior of what looks now more like the interior of a traditional underground house. The outside space was going to have all of these plants as part of the plan for what is it, landscape architecture. And when we showed the blueprints up north, they told us that doesn't exist here. So we ended up with pebbles, which is what a beach looks like, which was much less expensive and maintenance-wise much less expensive. So it was one of the cool surprises of all of this. We had also gotten ready to hire a high-end documentary filmmaker to spend a ridiculous amount of money to go film bears frolicking in the snow. And we spent, in the end, technology-wise and in terms of filming the videos, not even a tenth of what they would have spent to make that documentary. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Once you bring it to other kinds of settings and other kinds of exhibitions, I know because the whole point is diversity, some of them might require more money, but it shouldn't be taken as a given that it's going to be more expensive.
And in terms of keeping it going and keeping funding happening, a lot of it has to do with what Dr. Loring was saying, is just we keep getting creative and keep coming up with ideas and ways that we can keep these conversations going and keep this connection going, and buy-in as well. This was a huge experiment that the zoo took on, and now it's, especially with our research department, because we're just flowing together with this, it's just become something everybody's really excited about and everybody really enjoys, participating in, so that helps a lot.
Jack, you have something to say?
Want to close it out, Jack?
Yeah, just sort of continuing on what I heard about being creative with funding and all of that. One of the things I always like to refer to is we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Many agencies and groups are struggling with the same problem. How do they effectively, gain access and entry into these communities, and how do they sort of create a mutually beneficial project? Kelly and I have talked about this just about a month ago. I had Obama's top Arctic advisor send me an email and ask me for a favor. And he said, Jack, I have 2 graduate students who want to gain entry into studying the research in rural Alaska, but they want a meaningful project. So these sort of questions are not unique. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there to continue to address and build this sort of a model. And it's just up to us to sort of be effective in how we relay and interpret the information.
I work with just to end this because I want to take on the comment by Mr. Hermione Horses about this has been done. One of the reasons that we don't know about it is because this is again, it's slightly counterintuitive, because it's not flashy, because it's not immediate, because it's not one thing and then nothing else, and it is about being constant. It is about working closely. It's about doing the day-to-day. I mean, one reason I admire Lisa's work so much is because of that, because she has built relationships that she has been nurturing, and that's what every little bit of what you have seen here is coming out of, and that is generally uninteresting to people. But when you are in front of that and are exposed to that, when you go to that small museum that has been doing that for a long time, you go home and you say, today I experienced something that I had never experienced in my life, and I saw something I would have never been able to see. So those people that get touched by that moment in that museum, by that effort that is so intimate, will be changed. But we have to be okay with the fact that it doesn't work like a multimedia $1 million campaign. It's the thing that if we do more of it and do it in more places and do it more deliberately, more people are going to be touched by it. But it's not going to grow into this atomic explosion of changing everybody's opinion immediately. It has to grow that way in order to work.
Yeah.
I wish it
Yeah,
would.
I just want to add a few more minutes, as Dr. Lauren touched on it as well. Adrian's absolutely right. How can we institute sort of long-term change? And that was really part of our strategy to engage the youth. You know, growing up in that area during that time, there's no opportunity at all. We had sort of little vision for what our future was going to be. And we're talking about instituting that type of change. Originally, the dialogue we started off with was, how do we build a young bumper crop of local scientists that then could be involved in the processes and sort of determining their own future. And you know, that's sort of what we're talking about. Well, how do you do that? Well, you create some sort of an opportunity. You can't underestimate the power of somebody different coming into the community and showing and teaching the children how to do something. Just exposing them to things that they probably never thought about or seen about. That's immensely and incredibly powerful. So that speaks to some of the success, but also some of the underlying things of what we're trying to address.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you all.